Hi, welcome to the Pre-Small History Hub. In this video, we're going to be looking at the Brown versus Topeka case in 1954, sometimes called Brown versus Board. So let's have a look at the kind of background to this case and why this case came about. So kind of one of the main reasons for the lack of progress for Black Americans in the South was due to obviously segregation, discrimination, these Jim Crow laws that had come about because of that Plessy versus Ferguson ruling that said that they were fine to be separate as long as equal opportunities were provided. But in a lot of cases, equal opportunities were not being provided, they were just being segregated. Which obviously one of the biggest areas that was creating a problem was within educational opportunities for Black Americans. Segregation meant Black Americans were not allowed to attend white schools, and in the Black schools, the facilities and the resources were far inferior to those provided for white Americans. So in South Carolina, for example, they spent 3 times more on white schools than they did on Black schools. So you can see just in this picture at the bottom of the screen what the comparison was like. So you've got the Black school on the left, the white school on the right. Facilities are much nicer at the white school on the right, much more cramped, more children in the class, not very good facilities on the left. So this just shows to you as well and summarises how much of a problem this was in the South. So this is a map of America showing the educational segregation prior to, so that's before the Brown versus Board of Education ruling. So in these red states down at the bottom in the South, it was actually required to have segregation. So they had to enforce segregation within schools. In the North and over here in the West as well, a little bit in some of these states in the West, it's actually forbidden. So there is, and then obviously there's a couple of states here where it's optional or it's limited or there's just no legislation around it. So it's up to like individual schools and school boards. So there was kind of quite a big north-south divide, and the main issue with segregation in education was in the southern states. So what actually was this law case and what was Brown versus Board of Education in Topeka? So in 1950, the NAACP, so if you're not sure what the NAACP are, I've explained what they are in the previous video on different groups. They asked a group of African American parents, which included a guy called Oliver Brown, to attempt to enroll their children into some all-white schools with the expectation that they would be turned down. So Oliver did attempt to do this with his daughter Linda Brown, who was only 8 years old at the time. And she was, in fact, as the NAACP thought, she was barred from enrolling at the local white school. But the white school was actually much closer to her home, whereas the black school was a mile away. And she was having to trek up all that way to go to a black school when there was a white school closer, but obviously they barred her from entering. So the strategy was for the NAACP to then file a lawsuit on behalf of these 13 families who represented different states. Okay, so they were going to kind of spread this across different states. This was led by the famous lawyer and NAACP member Thurgood Marshall, who had already achieved some success in some law cases within the NAACP. And he presented evidence to the Supreme Court that stated that separate education facilities lowered self-esteem of children and was psychologically harmful to them in the long run. So the evidence also pointed out that educational achievement was being restricted because of this policy. So it was Thurgood Marshall's aim that he was hoping to kind of overturn that Plessy versus Ferguson ruling of separate but equal. And by overturning that, it would mean integration within schools. The process did take around 18 months, and finally the decision to ban school segregation was announced on the 17th of May in 1954. So Chief Justice Warren, who is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time, he concluded that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Okay, so just within education, they've effectively now overturned that Plessy versus Ferguson case. Okay, and that's one of the newspaper headlines from the time, so school segregation banned. So what actually was the significance of Brown versus Topeka then, and was it actually enforced properly in the South? Despite the judgment ruling against segregated education, it did not specify how integration should actually be carried out, apart from just a vague notion was given of it must be done at the earliest possible speed. So they never actually laid out, the Supreme Court never laid out proper plans of this is how they were going to do it, therefore forcing school boards to desegregate. And some areas did begin to desegregate. By 1957, more than 300,000 black children were attending schools that had formerly been segregated. However, there were 2.4 million black Southern children who were still being educated in these segregated Jim Crow schools that were not as well invested in as the white schools were. So there were many states, especially obviously in the South, that took deliberate measures to keep schools separate. Okay, so they tried to get around this Brown versus Topeka ruling. President Eisenhower, who was president of America at the time, did not step in to enforce integration because he didn't really want to cause further opposition in the South. Remember that he's trying to win over voters. White people are the main kind of core pool of voters. He doesn't want to annoy them. So he said it would be just plain nuts if he used force to carry out the Brown decision. So in 1956, as well, the University of Alabama did accept a black student, Otherin Lucy. This was a government court order that had been secured by the NAACP. But many white students did riot, and the university authorities then removed her, and she was forbidden to re-enter the university. So it was 1963 before black Americans were finally allowed to study there. So people did try with this ruling to enforce it, but it didn't always happen. How did different groups of people react to it in the South? So the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK, as they were known, which I'll also do a separate video on within opposition groups, have been extremely popular in the 1920s and now had begun to re-emerge. So they were one of the groups that were obviously opposed to this ruling. Some parents joined something called a White Citizens Council, which aimed to maintain segregation. Again, that'll be in the video on opposition groups. Okay, so that's just an example of the kind of thing white citizens' councils would put out. So more than 100 Southern senators and congressmen actually signed something called the Southern Manifesto, which was a big document that opposed racial integration within education. So there was people within the government that were opposing the Brown ruling. So over the next 2 years, Southern state legislatures passed more than 450 laws and resolutions aimed at preventing the Brown decision actually being enforced. So even though this was something that was enforced by the Supreme Court, not all states wanted to abide by it, and they actually did try and get around it. Some of the southern states acted as they did because they kind of saw the federal government as acting in a dictatorial manner. So basically making them do something without their choice, therefore taking away their independence. So this meant that they could say their actions were political rather than racist. So by kind of pushing back against the Brown decision, they were saying, well, we're only doing it because you're forcing something upon us and we want to remain kind of independent and make our own laws rather than have the federal government tell us what to do. Okay, so that's how they tried to get around it being kind of a racist decision. Okay, that's Brown versus Board. Don't forget to subscribe to the Personal History Hub.